Hi everyone, sorry I can't be there today. I thought I'd do a recording of the Daniel Dennett reading that we've been working through so that you can finish it off. If you've got it, get out the reading. It's the one called Elbow Room by Daniel Dennett. We've done a little bit of the reading, but for those of you who might have been away or if you didn't quite get it the first time, I'll just do this recording for the whole reading that we've got. And then that way you can go back and check it out if anything is unclear. Okay, so pens and highlighters at the ready, and here we go. So Elbow Room by Daniel Dennett. Number one, the perennial gripping problem. The idea of fate is older than philosophy itself, and since the dawn of the discipline, philosophers have been trying to show what is wrong with the idea that our fates are sealed before we are born. It has seemed very important to demonstrate that we are not just acting out our destinies, but somehow choosing our own courses, making decisions, not just having decisions occur to us. Ideas about causation were at the focus of attention in the early days of Greek philosophy, and it occurred to some to wonder whether all physical events are caused or determined by the sum total of all prior events. If they are, if, as we say, determinism is true, then our actions as physical events must themselves be determined. If determinism is true, then our every deed and decision is the inexorable outcome, it seems, of the sum of physical forces acting at the moment, which in turn is the inexorable outcome of the forces acting an instant before, and so on, to the beginning of time. So what Daniel Dennett is saying in this opening part is basically, this question of free will has been an important one in philosophy, for the last, 3,000 years, really. Um, and he's sort of suggesting a reason for this. He's sort of saying that, like, we've always had the impression and maybe even the desire to believe that we are in control of our decision making, that we are more than just the outcome of cause and effect. And as it says in the second paragraph there, when he's talking about determinism, if the universe, and particularly if humanity, is ruled by determinism, what that means is there is nothing more to us than simply cause and effect. One thing leads to another, which leads to another, and that fate is inescapable. And whilst it might feel like we make decisions, actually they're not genuine decisions. They're sort of an illusion that makes us feel like we have free will when actually we don't. What Dennett's going to do is sort of talk about where these problems arose from. So the first thing that he discusses is, as I said, the idea that sort of we have this desire for our life to be greater, for lack of a better term, than it appears to be if we accept determinism. Okay, if determinism is true, then human life is, it's just the process of the universe like everything else. But the second one, which he's going to spend more time on in the reading, is that philosophers through history have kind of muddied the waters when we're talking about free will, because they've made it seem like the absence of free will would be this terrifying reality, when actually Dennett is going to be saying, actually, it's not. Like, free will isn't the absence of free will, so a determinism, isn't terrifying really at all. So let's continue and we'll see what he means by this. Okay, so why do people find the free will problem gripping? In part, surely, because it touches deep and central questions about our situation in the universe, about the human condition, as one portentously says. But also, I will argue, because philosophers have conjured up a host of truly frightening bugbears, and then subliminally suggested, quite illicitly, that the question of free will is whether any of these bugbears actually exist. So basically, Dennett's accusing philosophers through history of basically like creating these terrifying scenarios and then kind of saying to people, well, if you don't want that to be true, then free will must exist. He thinks that this is a little bit underhanded. Um, There are a host of analogies to be found in the literature. Not having free will would be somewhat like being in prison, or being hypnotized, or being paralyzed, or being a puppet, or the list continues. I do not think these analogies are merely useful illustrations, merely graphic expository devices. I think they are at the very foundation of the problem. Without them to anchor the philosophical discussions, the free will problem would float away, at best a curious issue to bemuse metaphysicians and puzzle mongers. So basically, what Dennett is saying here is if we strip away all of these terrifying scenarios that philosophers have created through the years, and we just look at what's really there when we're talking about free will, it's actually quite mundane and boring, and not terrifying at all. And so Dennett's going to try and show how he can do that, how he can get rid of these terrifying scenarios that philosophers have presented in the past. Um, so he'll go through a few different examples. And yeah, as we read through, each one has its own subheading in Dennett's reading. So yeah, hopefully you'll be able to keep up with that. So number 2, the boogeymen. The first of the bugbears are quite literally boogeymen, boogie persons if you insist, for they are all conceived as agents who vie with us for control of our bodies, who compete against us, who have interests antithetical to or at least independent of our own. Now the word agents there is italicized for good reason. What Dennett is saying here is philosophers often create these characters that they use to show that that a life without free will would be terrifying because of these characters that exist. And we're going to see the different ones. You can see them on the screen there. The invisible jailer and the nefarious neurosurgeon and the malevolent mind reader. Great naming here by Dennett. But the question we really have to ask is, well, do these agents actually exist? Like, do they really exist in reality? Because Dennett's going to be arguing that they don't. And the burden of proof is on the person who's saying that they do exist. So, yeah, do we have any evidence of any of these, terrifying agents controlling our free will? And Dennett's going to show, no, we don't. Okay. These fearsome fellows are often used by philosophers as reverse cheerleaders, gloom leaders, you might call them, ushered onto the stage whenever anxiety flags, whenever the urgency of the topic under discussion becomes doubtful. As intricacy piles on intricacy, the reader begins to yawn and fidget, but is quickly regalvanized by a nudging analogy. But that would be like finding yourself in the clutches of... Okay, and here, so this is Dennett sort of saying this is what philosophers do. Instead of dealing with reality about free will and determinism, which is actually quite boring, they create these, these monsters that imprison us, and that sort of gets people's attention, but people aren't thinking critically about whether these monsters actually exist. So, firstly, the invisible jailer. Prisons are dreadful. Prisons are to be shunned. Anyone who fails to understand this is not one of us. Well, if prison is bad, what does it contrast with? If one is not in prison, one is free. In one important sense, and each of us can reflect gratefully on how glad we are not to be in prison. Aha, says the fearmonger. What makes you so sure you're not in prison? Sometimes it's obvious when one is in prison, but sometimes it isn't. A sly jailer may conceal the steel bars in the window mullions and install dummy doors in the walls. If you opened one, you would see a brick wall behind it. It might be some time before a prisoner realized he was in prison. Are you sure you're not in some sort of prison? Here one is invited to consider a chain of transformations taking us from obvious prisons to unobvious, but still dreadful prisons, to utterly invisible and undetectable, but still dreadful prisons. So Dennett here is presenting, in class when we were going through this reading, I talked about the Matrix. And the Matrix is a great example of this idea of the invisible prison. The people who live in the Matrix don't realize they're in prison. They think they're free. They think they're autonomous. Um, they think they have freedom of choice, but in reality, they don't, because they're inside the Matrix, and so they're being controlled by the machines. Dennett's going to sort of present an alternative way to look at this. Consider a deer in Magdalen College Park. Is it imprisoned? Yes, but not much. The enclosure is quite large. Suppose we moved the deer to a larger enclosure, the New Forest with a fence around it. Would the deer still be imprisoned? In the state of Maine, I am told, deer almost never travel more than 5 miles from their birthplace during their lives. If an enclosure were located outside the normal, unimpeded limits of a deer's lifetime's wanderings, would the deer enclosed be imprisoned? Perhaps, but note that it makes a difference to our intuitions whether someone installs the enclosure. Do you feel imprisoned on Earth the way Napoleon was stuck on Elba? It is one thing to be born and live on Elba, and another to be put and kept on Elba by someone. A jail without a jailer is not a jail. Whether or not it is an undesirable abode depends on other features. It depends on just how, if at all, it cramps the style of its inhabitants. So I find this deer example that Dennett uses to argue against the invisible jailer to be a really clarifying example. I think it paints the picture really clearly. If I've got a deer that has throughout its life, it will travel no more than 5-mile radius from where it was born, and I have a fence 6 miles away from where it was born in a radius around it, the deer will spend its entire life and never see the fence. It will never be stopped from doing anything that it wants. Now, in our question, is it restricted? Well, yes, it is. It can't get past that fence at 6 miles. But from the deer's point of view, is it restricted? No, absolutely not. It'll never even know that there was a fence there. Now, obviously someone needs to put up a fence, but it's a good example of how free will, well, at least the illusion of free will, can fit with determinism. At the end here, Dennett says, do you feel imprisoned on planet Earth? For the vast majority of us, at least, will never leave this planet. That it will simply not occur. And, if we even were to take a greater example and say, okay, well, what, for the handful of people in humanity who will leave this planet, no one living today is going to leave this solar system, certainly not. But are we imprisoned in our solar system? You can't possibly leave it. So it's a bit like a prison like that. But are you imprisoned here? The point that Dennett's making here is that, well, there's no one has made a jail for us. Okay, there is no invisible jailer. Do we have absolute free will? No, we don't, because there's lots of things that we can't possibly do. But does that mean that we are being controlled by someone, by an agent? No, it doesn't. It just means that there are physical limitations on our reality. As he says there, it depends, right at the end, it depends on just how, if at all, it cramps the style of the inhabitants. Let's continue on. The nefarious neurosurgeon. How would you like to have someone strap you down and insert electrodes in your brain and then control your every thought and deed by pushing buttons on the master console? Consider, for instance, the entirely typical invocation of this chap by Fisher, the ominous Dr. Black, who arranges things in poor Jones's brain so that Black can control Jones's activities. Jones, meanwhile, knows nothing of this. First, we may ask, as we always should, why is this other rival agent introduced? Why bring Dr. Black into it? Couldn't the example get off the ground just as well, for instance, if Jones had a brain tumour that produced odd results. So just to pause for a second there, this next example, Dennett is talking about one that another philosopher or writer has presented, Fisher, this Dr. Black example. So basically, it's like, imagine if someone performed surgery on your brain so they gained control of your brain and they could make you think or feel anything that they wanted to by stimulating different parts of your brain with electrodes. Dennett's sort of saying, why are we adding this evil character, this nefarious neurosurgeon into the scenario? Okay. And he's going to sort of talk about this in a moment with a really good example of a brain tumor. As instead of Dr. Black, what if someone has a brain tumor? Okay, so what makes Fisher's version more dreadful is that Jones's control of his own activities has been usurped or taken over by another controller, Dr. Black. A tumor might cause this or that in someone's brain, and it would be terrible indeed to have a debilitating brain tumor, but it would take an awfully smart tumor to control someone's brain. Variations on the nefarious neurosurgeon are the hideous hypnotist and the peremptory puppeteer. Again, great naming by Dennett. We all know we all know about stage hypnotists. We think we do in any case. And what is particularly chilling about them is that, unlike the nefarious neurosurgeon, they leave no physical trace of their influence. So the last part there, Dennett's really just talking about, maybe it's not a neurosurgeon, maybe it's someone who hypnotizes people, or maybe it's, a puppeteer, someone pulling the strings of you as a person. But the tumor example, I think, is a really telling one, because what's really scary about the nefarious neurosurgeon thought experiment is that there would be this person who would seek to control you. And that's the terrifying part. Not that you're being controlled, but that someone is doing that. Okay, that there is this other person who is meddling with your mind. That's the terrifying part. But if we remove that and we replace it with something terrible, but much more mundane, something like someone developing a brain tumor, or, another example is someone developing dementia. When we see people who have brain tumors or have dementia, we see that their behavior changes, and it's very clear that they're not choosing for that behavior to change. Think of someone who has Parkinson's Parkinson's disease, rather. This dementia-based illness results in uncontrollable tremors that the person experiences. Their hands shake constantly, for example. They have trouble with walking because their strides become sort of funny. They don't walk in like a smooth motion. Now, it's very clear that they're not choosing for this to occur. It's very clear that because of the damage that Parkinson's disease is doing to their brain, this is the effect of that. The key point we need to take away is they're utterly helpless to do anything about it. Okay, so they are being controlled by Parkinson's disease, but we don't look at Parkinson's disease as this agent who is controlling the person. We just look at it as, well, it's unfortunate you've got this disease, and these are the symptoms of it. It's not good, but at no point do we see Parkinson's disease as autonomous itself, as its own person who's seeking to control the other person. This is the key thing that Dennett wants you to take away. It's like, there is no boogeyman here. Okay? We see the illusion of free will stripped from us when we get things like brain tumors, or when we get things like dementia. Okay? And at no point do we look at that and go, oh, that Parkinson's disease is controlling that person for their own purposes. Parkinson's disease has its own plan. No, it's just the disease. And when you get the disease, it results in certain functions being lost, like the ability to control movement. Essentially, when you get effect of Parkinson's disease, you get, when you get cause Parkinson's disease, you get effect of hand tremors, cause and effect, just like other deterministic factors. It's just that this one is an illness. So what Dennett is saying is these philosophers are adding in these evil characters into their thought experiments so that they are more terrifying, so that we want to resist against them more. But when we look at the real world examples of people losing their free will, we realize that it's simply because of a physical factor. And if losing at least what we feel like is our free will is because of physical factors, then everything in the universe, well, at least in our universe, is deterministic. It's just physical things operating in a predictable way. Okay. Finally, the last one that Dennett is going to present here is the malevolent mind reader. So this agent is essentially an opponent, but he does not cause or control your moves. He just foresees them and stymies them. Playing rock, so stymies is a sort of fancy way of saying stops them or gets in the way of them. Playing rock, paper, or scissors against this fellow is hopeless, for since he knows exactly what rut you're in, what policy you're following, he can see in advance which move you intend to make and always counters successfully. If only you could shield your mind from him. If only you could find a strategy of unpredictability that would be proof against his calculations. Then you wouldn't be so impotent, so vulnerable in the game of life. I'll just pause there. So in this scenario, it's not necessarily someone controlling you, but someone who knows everything you're going to do. And in this way, they can sort of get in the way of any plan that you want. They can't stop you from having the plan, but they can stop the plan from coming to fruition, by getting in the way, by stopping, like it says there, if you're playing rock, paper, scissors against them and obviously your plan is to win, well, they can stop that plan because they know what you're going to choose. It's not that they control the choice, but they know it and they can get in the way. Okay. Predictions matter in a special way when one has a stake in them, when they are not merely future tense statements, but rather wagers which one might want to make come true and an opponent might want to make come false. In real life, one often comes into competition with other people and even with other organisms, outwitting the rat or mosquito, for instance. But in the cosmic game of life, against whom is one wagering? So, think of a mosquito that you're trying to sort of swat away. You're in a competition with the mosquito. Are you going to keep it off your skin, or is the mosquito going to land and extract its meal from you? You're in this sort of arm wrestle with it, right? What Dennett's pointing out is that's because you're up against another organism. But is fate another organism? Is determinism, so is the process of cause and effect like a mosquito that has its own will and its own goals? Or is it simply the operation of the universe? Okay, Dennett here is clearly implying that there is no operator in life. Okay, it's not like the mosquito who's trying to land on your arm so that it can get some blood. The universe isn't trying to do one thing or another. The universe is simply a series of events that will play out in the way that they're predicted to play out. Nothing more or less. Okay. Again, he's pointing out that there is no sort of conscious being that's controlling you. Okay. I cannot prove that none of the boogeymen in this rogues gallery really exist, any more than I can prove that the devil or Santa Claus don't exist. But I am prepared to put on a sober face and assure anyone who needs assuring that there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that any of these horrible agents exists. But of course, if any of them did, woe on us. A closet with a ghost in it is a terrible thing. But a closet that is just like a closet with a ghost in it, except for lacking the ghost, is nothing to fear. So we arrive at what may turn out to be a useful rule of thumb. Whenever you spy a boogeyman in a philosophical example, check to see if this scary agent, who is surely fictitious, is really doing all the work. So Dennett's sort of ghost in the closet example here, what he's saying is like, if any of these things, these ideas actually existed, you know, the invisible jailer, the nefarious neurosurgeon, the malevolent mind reader, if they really existed, then like it's right to be afraid of them. Like it's right to be terrified of them. Um, but it's a bit like being worried about a ghost in your closet. Um, if the ghost is really there, then that would be terrifying. But is it? Or is it just a closet? And when you open the doors of that closet, is it actually pretty ordinary? You know, I'm sure that we've all had instances where we've heard a noise and it scared us. And in our imagination, we've created this, you know, there's someone in the house, or, you know, how did that happen? Or it must be a ghost, or whatever we're talking about. And then, you know, you creep downstairs terrified of what you're going to find. And you realize that, like, you know, the cat knocked over a vase. And that's it. And what we realize is, oh, it was our imagination, our creation of another agent, of the robber who had broken into your house. That's what created the terror, not the event itself. The sound of the vase being knocked down wasn't terrifying. It was the creation of the person who you imagined that did it. And once you realize that the person is there, the event hasn't changed. You still heard the noise. Okay, that still happened. But the terror is gone because now it's quite ordinary. And that's how Dennett is encouraging us to look at philosophical ideas. Before we turn them into these extraordinary notions, let's look at the ordinary first. Okay. So what Dennett's going to do is provide us with a good example of the ordinary. Okay. He's going to have a look at it in a very real way and ask us, is there some sort of evil character at play here? Or is this a good example of something that's pretty straightforward? Okay. And he's going to use the example. Apologies to anyone who might have issues with insects on your screen, but here comes a wasp. He's going to use the example of a digger wasp or a sphex wasp. So let's have a look what Dennett's going to say. So I'll just finish that paragraph before we get to number 3. So Dennett urges us to reconsider determinism after dissociating it from these far-fetched figments of imagination. He presents an account of the instinctive behavior of wasps and asks whether our behavior could be analogous. Might we too be at the mercy of brute causation? So Dennett's going to give us an example of a wasp's behavior here. What I want you doing while you're thinking about it is I want you to think about things that you do that seem like you've exercised your free will. Okay? Seems like you've chosen to act in one way, particularly like really complex behavior. Okay? And then I want you to ask yourself, is it possible that a little bit like the wasp, even this very complex behavior is actually just the expression of cause and effect? Okay, so let's jump in. Number 3, this is going to be very hard to say. Sphecishness and other worries. My main worry is Dennett's writing, honestly. But there are other fears fueling the free will problem that do not have personified objects. It often seems to people that if determinism were true, there would have to be something mechanical about our processes of deliberation that we would regret. We could not be free agents, but only automata, insect-like in our behavior. Consider the digger wasp, or the sphex ichneumonius. So you even get the Latin classification for the wasp there from Dennett. So what Dennett is going to do is show us an example using the wasp. It's going to show really complex behavior. But what we're going to see is that even that complex behavior is actually just a process of cause and effect. Could this be true of our quote unquote free will as well? Could something even as, apparently like free to decide as what you eat for lunch today, is that actually simply a process of cause and effect coming out in a predictable way? It's just that it's very complex. Okay, so here we go. When the time comes for egg laying, the wasp sphex builds a burrow for the purpose and seeks out a cricket which she stings in such a way as to paralyze but not kill it. She drags the cricket into the burrow, lays her eggs alongside, closes the burrow, then flies away, never to return. In due course, the eggs hatch and the wasp grubs feed off the paralyzed cricket, which has not decayed, having been kept in the wasp equivalent of deep freeze. To the human mind, such an elaborately organized and seemingly purposeful routine conveys a convincing flavor of logic and thoughtfulness, until more details are examined. So just to pause, what a great example of nature, doing its work. So if you didn't keep up, the wasp mother, before it lays its eggs, it digs a hole, and then it goes and finds a cricket. It stings it, but not so that it dies. The cricket is actually paralyzed by the sting, so it stays alive. The wasp then drags the cricket to its den, for lack of a better term, checks the den to make sure everything is safe, drags the cricket in, lays its eggs, and then closes it up and flies away. It doesn't stick around to see the birth of its children. Now, when the grubs are born, they eat the cricket, which has been kept fresh because it didn't actually die a long time ago. It was paralyzed. And they grow up to be wasps themselves and continue this, behavior. Now, when we look at this, it's like, oh my God, look at the planning that's gone into place. So, I mean, think of what the wasp has apparently decided to do here. It's understood that it's about to give birth, well, not necessarily give birth, but lay its eggs, right? And it understands that in the future, its children will need food once they hatch. So it creates a safe environment for its children. It digs a hole and it even gets food for it. But it gets the food in such a way that the food poses no threat to the children and the food will stay as fresh as possible. Okay. So what an amazing turn of events. What wonderful planning here by the wasp. Okay. It's protecting its children. It's getting food for it, and it's operating in such a way that it seems like there is so much planning involved in what the wasp has done. But let's dig a little bit deeper here. So, for example, the wasp's routine is to bring the paralyzed cricket to the burrow, leave it on the threshold, go inside to see all is well, emerge, and then drag the cricket in. Okay, so it doesn't take the cricket straight in. It drags it to, you can see on the screen there's the hole that the wasp has burrowed. So it'll drag the cricket to the edge of the hole, go down into the burrow to make sure that everything's okay, and then come up and actually bring the cricket in. Okay. If the cricket is moved a few inches away while the wasp is inside making her preliminary inspection, the wasp, on emerging from the burrow, will bring the cricket back to the threshold, but not inside, and will then repeat the preparatory procedure of entering the burrow to see that everything is all right. So in other words, it leaves it at the doorway to the burrow again, and it goes down to check that everything's okay. If again the cricket is removed a few inches while the wasp is inside, once again she will move the cricket up to the threshold and re-enter the burrow for a final check. The wasp never thinks of pulling the cricket straight in. On one occasion, this procedure was repeated 40 times, always with the same result. So we see here, some experimenter who is maybe a little bit cruel. Maybe this is one of those boogeymen that Dennett was warning us about, or telling us not to worry about, rather. Um, 40 times in a row, the wasp brought the cricket to the edge of the burrow and went in to check the burrow. And while the cricket was in there, this experimenter moved the cricket a couple of inches. The wasp came out, saw that the cricket had moved, went and got the cricket, dragged it back to the top of the den, and then went back down and checked again. And then came up, but the experimenter had moved the cricket again. So the wasp moved it back, left it at the doorway, went back down. The experimenter moved the cricket. The wasp comes back up, grabs the cricket, brings it back to the doorway, goes back down. The experimenter moves the cricket 40 times in a row. 40 times. And we see the exact same result. So what this shows us is even this extraordinary example of behavior by the digger wasp, that seems to be so carefully planned and, importantly, so well thought out, is actually simply a process of cause and effect. When certain conditions are apparent, or when certain conditions appear, certain effects will take place. If I do not interrupt the digger wasp, it will come back up and then drag the cricket down, lay its eggs, and then leave, covering up the burrow when it leaves. But if I move the cricket, it will come up, then move the cricket back to the doorway, repeat its safety check, come back up. And if I move the cricket again, it'll get caught in this loop. In theory, forever. 40 times in a row it did it. All right, so what Dennett is showing here is even really, really complex behavior, and even behavior that looks like it must have been chosen freely, could potentially be deterministic behavior. It could potentially be behavior that is just based on cause and effect. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our little unit on free will and determinism. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Check your outlines for the coursework you need to do, and hopefully I'll see you at school soon. All right, bye. Have a great day.